And all of this is being brought to you by Kurt McVeigh and
Ashley Taylor.
And the two of us have been up to some really interesting things for the last, how long?
About a year and a half.
About a year and a half? It's not more than that now?
No, it's about that.
When did we first meet?
Well, yeah, it was a little earlier than that. It was spring of 2023 in New York.
Right. And yeah, I feel like, the Munchkins were just waking up a little bit after all the sort of COVID stuff, coming back, taking an assessment of everything going on and saying, what's here to stay, what needs to get wrapped up, what needs to be transitioned. And you and I sort of collaborated on a few things kind of informally, which was fun. You had 2 spaces in Red Hook, Brooklyn. One was more of like a sort of photo shoot event space, more for like cool dinner parties and some other things. And then the other one was more sort of like cool sound baths, more formal, sort of like a large group yoga talks, and then also kind of like club nightlife components. So tell me about the 2 of those and what that was like, not only running those, but eventually moving on to a different chapter.
I think those spaces came about in a time where I was seeing that there was just a need for places for people to come together that wasn't necessarily for any commercial purpose. It was really about building community and starting to diagnose what is in the way of us building community today. And a lot of that was about in-person spaces and places where people of like different backgrounds could come together, that they wouldn't necessarily find themselves in that type of a space in, like a coffee shop or a commercial event or something like this. So those spaces had business models that would support them. Those were like the photo shoots and the events. And so that allowed the operations to be sustainable. And then they were available for a bunch of different like nonprofit, social cause organizations. People would get in touch and say, I want to do some sort of event on the weekend, and it's for free, and it's for communities that are, solving different local problems. And so I just built a lot of relationships and partnerships on that front. But I also saw a lot of the limitations of doing something so physical. And that was what was inspiring the direction to how could you build sort of an app or a component to connect people to do this, not just in the spaces that I was cultivating, but in all the different spaces that exist within different communities.
Yeah, doing things physical. There's, setting up, sound checks for performing artists, moving the furniture around, getting out the yoga mats, filling up, the cooler with beverages. There's that. But I think, those COVID years, looking back nostalgically almost at this point, perhaps not fondly, that brought into a new context what is physical, right? Just being present physically with other people was suddenly brought into this new context. This is something people, for the most part, people who are able to move freely throughout the world, that was a new thing. Restrictions in terms of gathering in public spaces with other people, with strangers, external sort of mandates, internal personal fears, all that kind of stuff. So it was all that stuff sort of clashing together. So you ran these places successfully, and somewhere around like spring into summer 2023, you decided to kind of like move in a new direction. And so I think I like maybe hosted one or two things. Pretty sure I misspoke and said one guy hails from like Columbia University, but he was actually a Stanford guy. I'm still not living that down in
He
my
was
own.
doing a stint at Columbia, though,
I
so
got
it was all
confused.
right.
He was mad. He was upset. Anyway, yeah. So, but anyway, we kind of saw eye to eye, not always sort of consciously. We didn't necessarily have to speak out, seeing things eye to eye, but I think we kind of worked well together. And, this is probably a good opportunity to speak to your history a little, to whatever degree you want to go into, and then maybe a little bit with me, and then how our own experiences brought us together to collaborate professionally and creatively.
Yeah, and I think to speak to that summer, 2023, when I was feeling the call to come back to New York, and when we met, and doing some of these events together, I think there was a general energy of like, do we get back to the way that things were? And there was a push for culturally for people to go back to something. And I think you and I were on the path of like, there's nothing really to go back to. There's a lot of problems in the world and in these systems, and there's a lot that needs to be created. And I think we sort of saw the writing on the wall, which has began to play out even more than I think we were imagining at that point, coming up on 2 years now from there. And I think we were seeing that new things needed to be created and fostered, and particularly in New York City, where you have all different people from different industries at high levels, pushing the boundaries. It's a good place to get a cultural movement going. And so I think that summer was really about seeding some of the intentions of that movement in terms of constructive problem solving and building things new that really address some of the problems of the past. And I think for me, that was sort of a callback to when I first came to New York. And I came here because I did feel New York has the potential for fostering things that are new and haven't been done before. And at that time, I was looking at the economy and sort of anticipating that things were going to get worse, and especially worse for the average individual, and even not just the average American, like the average person around the world. This was about 2013, and a lot of my early career was focused on research and sort of diagnosing these potential problems and looking at what is being done to address these problems in the future. And a lot of that work led me to things like financial technology and specifically blockchain. And I got involved with some projects that were now known as the Ethereum platform. And I helped out with the launch of that project, the American launch, which really came out of New York here with some people at a company that's now called Consensus. But at the time, it was really just some, developers and people in a room talking about a potential new future where technology is helping to address a lot of social and economic inequality. And I think what was cool about that experience is sort of seeing something that was really just an idea on paper that turned into something that was quite large. I didn't necessarily agree with a lot of the decisions that were made by a lot of the people early on in that community that turned it into something that wasn't really the reason that I got involved in the first place.
Do you want to explain what you felt the initial intention was, or what drew you to that, and maybe where that went off course, or why? I can understand not wanting to go too in depth, But tell us a little bit about what some of the expectations were from your perspective, from some of the founders' perspectives, and maybe actual sort of like impact elements connected to that currency, or So yeah, tell us a little bit about expectations and how that maybe didn't line up eventually, or not entirely.
Yeah, and I think in the beginning, there was a lot of discussion about technologies that could be built that enable more economic opportunities for more people. And this was often talked about as lowering the barriers to entry for opportunity. And I think that is an idea that's still very attractive here in America, where we celebrate things like meritocracy. But I think a lot of us have started to reach a consensus that meritocracy has a lot of problems in terms of it being an actuality for a lot of people. There's a lot of barriers in terms of growing up in certain environments where you have a lot more to deal with, frankly, than people who grow up in other environments where they have a lot more resources at their disposal. So I think the early blockchain movement was trying to see how could there be ways to lower the barriers of entry to having an economic opportunity in this country. And I think that's a mission or a vision that can unite a lot of people. What started to happen is that in order to build a lot of these technologies, people took investment from outside firms. And
meaning a lot of established financial institutions with maybe even big names. And then once that sort of happens, you're not so decentralized anymore. You're not so free anymore, sort of proving that everything is dependent upon sort of established capital, established infrastructure. Maybe not entirely dependent, but at least to some degree dependent. Well, go in depth more about that, and that might not be totally true, but what is that kind of what you mean? Like, some of these big banks or these big firms, or, with big names. Yeah. So yeah, take us through that a little bit. You don't have to go super in, but was that sort of where you saw the cracks starting to come in a little bit? And
I mean, I remember one crack being in the first year at Consensus, Ethereum didn't exist yet, meaning it was being built. It hadn't been launched into the world. And there was a moment when it was launched and people could participate on the blockchain and start to build different things on the blockchain, but they could also buy the underlying cryptocurrency that ran it. And I remember there being like a night and day moment when in all the kind of meetings and times before that, there had been a lot more discussion about the types of things that could be built in the future and the problems that could be solved. And very quickly, the discussion that became more dominant was a like trading sort of discussion related to the particular cryptocurrency. So it's not that that's inherently bad. It's just that that conversation started to overtake the conversation about what problems are we solving and what infrastructure do we need to build to solve it. And then what became cool were the people who were making money by trading, which meant that that was being celebrated. So the people who actually wanted to build things that just took a lot more time to consider and figure out, that no longer had a place that was like center stage. And it sort of faded and waned over time and took a back seat at that moment. But now I would say it just sort of largely fizzled out. And so I think the reason that happens is because it's the same thing that happens in like the economy today with quarterly shareholder reports, where we have companies that prioritize what their stock price is doing every quarter versus prioritizing these like long-term decisions, which would maybe be what someone would call like more productive long-term decision making about how to add more value. And it just becomes a short-sighted culture, which is like, how much money can I make in a short amount of time, which is really incompatible with how can I build something that really addresses some sort of big fundamental problem like we're talking about here, which is economic opportunity. So I just think those two things are too incompatible. So how could you reconcile them? And I think that's largely what we're up to here, is saying, how could we build a different movement, a different community who really is interested and focused on that long-term problem-solving vision? We understand that there's capital that needs to be invested, and we understand that, or I believe that that capital should be able to access a return. I think the question is, how short-term is that return, and is that return coming at the expense of other people? And just sort of a last point on that, in the cryptocurrency world, a lot of the money that's made comes at the expense of really like an average person who's sort of buying in at the wrong moment and losing a bunch of money. So a lot of those games are really not designed to actually help the average person.
Yeah. Ethereum was big, obviously, with NFTs. A lot of like the premier platforms that hosted a lot of NFTs used Ethereum, correct? And a lot of the big talk was, keeping track, the ledger, royalties. And, people in the art world talk about artists not getting a lot of, or any, money when works go into the secondary market or whatever. And it's like, the original purchase price, and then, a couple of years go by, maybe several years go by, maybe not too many years go by, and it sells for, many times your original sale price, and the artist gets nothing. So the royalties thing was a big thing. But, everything has seemed to, not everything, there's obviously all sorts of exceptions, but like sort of in the mainstream discourse outside of what, the current United States president is doing in terms of, speaking to what Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in general in terms of policy or, Federal reserves and stuff like that. This stuff makes headlines. But what gets considerably more attention is like the post-election meme coins, from Hawk to Trump, then Melania, and the inevitable, this amount of people leave $2 billion of their own money on the floor. And I think from my perspective, there's always this sort of thing like, I guess people could say this about, depending on what side of the aisle you're on politically, the what are you thinking, or what were you thinking, or why weren't you more informed? This goes back all the way to sort of like almost like pre-NFT days, right? Sort of like the original sort of Ethereum white paper was in like 2014, right? So if you're talking about, these people who signed up for these mortgages that were doomed to fail, that, these potential homeowners who never had, a chance in the long run to sustain these mortgages. Why did they sign on the dotted line? What is that? And I do think a part of that is being grossly underinformed, to some degree misled. If you're talking about the subprime mortgage situation, it's a lot of, brokers and real estate people who are happy to push these sort of faulty mortgages onto people who couldn't really afford them and all this kind of stuff. And now you have, these sort of like meme coins, or even like the NFT thing, which is when like the rug pull notion really started to come into sort of mainstream discourse. And now you have the president, the first lady, putting out these meme coins and people losing all this money. Some people making a lot of money, a lot of people losing a lot of money. And, a lot of times it seems now, because there's so much information, it would seem, about how extractive and potentially misleading a lot of this is, that people would have to be more informed and be more protected. And yet that doesn't seem to be the case. There's all these people with sort of righteous fury and frustration about having the rug pulled out from underneath them. And I just like, how much sympathy is due here, right? And I guess everybody has their own metric, and, what sort of pressure should be put on the individual who launches these things, And yeah, so I was just saying, I think there was a lot of interesting stuff going on in terms of, in 2020, 2021 into 22, in terms of big platforms being built to host NFTs, and then all these conversations about how this could find its way into the actual IRL contemporary art world for provenance and contracts and artist royalties. And I'm sure a lot of that's out there, but I wouldn't say it's sort of taken over in the mainstream. So yes, it seems like not everything, but in terms of like the everyday individual, not the United States or other countries banking a bunch of Bitcoin in their sort of reserve and hopefully turning a profit. But it seems like the average individual is still, to put it this way, like on the outside and often potentially on the losing end of what cryptocurrency is. Now, what's also happening in society, and this is what a lot of people who are sort of pro crypto or deeply invested or winning in that capacity, is they might point to just our regular old system and say, well, look at all this wealth concentrated in the hands of a very few individuals. And look at all these people like, over here who are like in the abyss, So I think for like this platform, we're going to try to avoid the sort of like, what about ism that is really problematic when it's important to discuss any situation or any system or any construct that has problems. You don't solve those problems by pointing at something totally different that also has problems. That's fine if they're correlated, if they're interrelated. But as a distraction or as a deflection, that doesn't work, right? So, all right, so I don't want to go completely off course there, but specifically, and again, this be those sort of like liability sort of issues, and some of this is probably a little behind the scenes, but, this idea of building things, just like sort of platforms that sort of use Ethereum, but were there any like big, like actual sort of like infrastructure things or sort of projects that were like, hey, this could be this, or this could be something really interesting, like something that maybe people haven't really heard before, considering you were there so early? Were there some things where you're like, wow, that could have been really interesting, that maybe didn't come to fruition, or it did and fizzled?
Yeah, and I think if you talk about like arts and music and NFTs, I think that's a good example. It's also an accessible example because a lot of people are familiar with how something like Spotify works, or how art galleries work, and how, secondary sales of art assets work. Those things are someone who's in the arts and culture, you've probably encountered some sort of person or transaction yourself related to that. And so I think that a lot of the technology was built to enable a lot of that, a lot of the positive imaginations there of, you're an artist and you can have more ownership and benefit of your work and how it gets used within the internet. And also, if someone else wants to own something that you produce and you want to be able to participate if they sell it in the future. And then even things like having more direct connection with your fans. And maybe you don't want to work with a traditional label. Maybe you actually have a big social media following and you could crowdfund from your fans directly. So a lot of the technology is built to do that. And I think we can be appreciative of the earlier technology movement to deliver a lot of open source code. What has yet to come to fruition are people who are, I think, authentic and revolutionary minded or forward thinking, being at the center stage of creating a lot of these projects. Like, they kind of need to get into the driver's seat, or at least be in the driver's seat with the technologists. So far, it's been like the technology people over here and no one who is actually from these industries or is an artist themselves is in the core decision-making process. And that is also part of the extractive design, right? Because it's like, oh, we're building this over here so that we can keep extracting from you. And not that I think that's very conscious. I think that's just the implicit game that we all have been playing for a really long time. So I think that a lot of the early ideas can still come to fruition. I think that a lot of the technology is there to make that happen. It's just about building the right relationships and setting up the right containers, meaning if you're going to do a crowdfund as an artist, do you have a plan with how you're going to use those funds to make sure that you don't rug pull your community? Because a lot of this happens unintentionally. It's just like, oh, I didn't know I could make like $80 million on the internet. It just kind of happens to some people when they're in right place at right time. But then if you have never been in charge of a huge budget like that, you might not know exactly how to deal with that kind of operation. You might not have figured out all of the ways to create some sort of new type of label with your fans. So there's just a lot more planning that needs to happen. And then there's a lot more of the right relationships that are built. And I think that we will start to see these things come to fruition. And I think a last point on that, like the community that is built around the internet and what gets kind of promoted to the top of the internet right now, it's a kind of extremist. Like, that's kind of the extremist voices are dominating. And so I think that if more reasonable people step forward with things that are actually beneficial, I think more and more people will start to adopt those types of things. So I think that we can still see a lot of this play out. We just have to help construct the right type of relationships and projects.
I want to talk about Radical Systems, a venture capital studio, which is also what Consensus was and possibly is. And what is a venture capital studio? Why studio and not like a firm? I know the answer to this is a rhetorical question, but maybe tell us why studio and why was that interesting and important?
Yeah, and I think this could also segue into like talking about our different backgrounds and you going more into your background, because when I started talking about this idea, what I was interested in was your background in helping to facilitate cultural and artistic movements. And I saw that that was what was needed to break through the limitations that were currently preventing a lot of the bigger ideas in the technology world that I had been part of from coming to fruition. And I also had seen like the power around a community that brought an idea to fruition with Ethereum, which then led to all these other cryptocurrency projects. You know, Ethereum was really just the beginning of a larger movement. And I thought that there was potential, and I think this is starting to happen, to create a movement around people starting to contribute to build better systems and to work in better ways and build a better economy, but using technology to do those types of things. And I think the venture capital studio was just the best kind of container to foster that narrative. And also, in terms of defining what the actual problem or problems were, a lot of companies get funding when they're at a place of we've defined the problem and we have the solution. And it's easy to do that if you're talking about I'm solving the problem of people not having advertising space for their local deli business, and I've created a new tool to help aggregate advertising for all the local delis. Like that's a very defined problem and solution that technology could enable. But the types of problems that we were talking about were very systemic.
I want to interrupt to be silly, but also like, is there an app or something that rates your classic like New York corner deli bodega? Like I feel like people take a lot of pride in their like deli/bodega. And, is there something out there that kind of like ranks them?
Well, Google Maps would have like reviews of your
it's got to go a step further, I think. But sorry to get me off track. I thought that was maybe a good idea because I would hype my local bodega/deli. Shout out to Lulu, Poncho, and the whole crew over there. All right. Anyway, so yeah, I think we're at this interesting point where it seems like there's this bullish president when it comes to the crypto. But it seems like largely he's talking about a reserve, talking about making it easier for those who have already banked a considerable amount of, let's say, Bitcoin, maybe some other things as well, to just see that go up, to see Bitcoin itself continually go up. But, and I know we want to sort of move towards what we're up to, but this notion of actual cryptocurrency being utilized as legitimate capital for infrastructure projects, is it just something to hedge, just a hedge, like gold is? And yes, is the gold there still? Has anyone verified this?
They are starting to call back a lot of the gold to America to actually see how much of it is able to be found right now. So that is happening.
Yes. Somebody asked us how we were funding this, and I think I said we go snorkeling for doubloons at old sort of Spanish wrecks. It's a good way to do things. But yeah, I think about that. Like, and this isn't all about like discussing sort of crypto here, but talking about, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about my sort of concerns with just what's happening in the sort of like publishing realms. Obviously, there's issues with media. It doesn't matter like where you are politically. If you're not, putting due scrutiny on all media platforms, and this isn't just to sort of be the sort of podcast sort of contrarian, but, as citizens, are you doing everything in your power to empower sort of media platforms that are doing the right thing? Are you even a place to diagnose if the right thing is being done? Is it right only because it aligns with you or whatever? So, yeah, I mean, we can go into that a bit more, but I'm just curious, can we see or have we seen cryptocurrency being used to better actual IRL infrastructure, right? Like the Key Bridge, if I'm not mistaken, just got, totaled, months ago. Whatever capital is needed to fix like an actual brick and mortar, if you will, sort of infrastructure project, have we seen crypto being utilized, whatever great stores of wealth that may exist there, can that actually be transferred into legitimate IRL capital to invigorate communities, fix broken things? Is this happening? How aware are you of this happening or not happening?
So it could happen. The technology is there to make it happen, but it requires human beings to set up those projects and organize a campaign. And once they have the funds, to manage them well so that things actually happen. And using the technology at what it's best at, potentially even distributing that capital to people who do tasks, who help to revitalize that infrastructure. So the answer is, it's technically possible. What doesn't seem to happen, or has not happened yet, are people who take the time and effort to put together those types of projects, to organize a lot of capital from the crowd, and then deliver upon them. If they do take on the projects, it's often to build some sort of technical infrastructure that remains within some sort of like crypto internet realm and largely does not break out into the real world. So my more like gracious self looks at that and says there's just a lot of experimentation going on, like a laboratory. They're seeing, does the technology actually work? There has not been a lot of then breaking out of that laboratory and connecting it to real world like infrastructure. The answer to that, though, is it's quite hard to do that, as we've been learning ourselves. You know, we didn't you can see that it takes a lot of time to think through what is the connection to all the different real world things. So I do think it's potentially just a little early for that. I think to your other point about the media related to this, a lot of the projects that get hype and attention are things that raise a lot of money really quickly and have a lot of speculation involved. What you're talking about from that person's perspective is kind of safe. It's kind of boring. It's about long-term returns. It's about impact. It's about real-world relationships. So the internet hasn't been doing a good job of promoting those things. Social media actively does not promote those things. So I think we live in a world where we think people don't value these things because we mostly connect with community online. And I think if we can shift that and we can see that there are more humans that actually value these types of things, we will see more of these types of projects start to get built and come to fruition.
Yeah, in a way, I feel like a lot of cryptocurrencies either just become like a hedge or a speculative asset. Something like Bitcoin, especially, drops off a little in the last couple of months or weeks, but probably still has expectations on it to go further up. And therefore, pulling that currency out in great sums for some sort of great rebuilding or something, or to sort of like supercharge IRL infrastructure domestically and abroad, is actually, in the grand scheme of things, not the sort of core use of that currency or sort of technology. If you're sitting on billions of dollars of Bitcoin and the notion is, yeah, it might drop X amount or it might go down here, it even could go down there, but on the long run, it's going to go up, 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 up. And therefore, why would you extract it? Maybe a little bit here for small investment projects that are built just to reify those things as a speculative asset. All right. So, okay. Yes. Okay, fine. So back to radical systems. I've written for a lot of publications in the mainstream, a lot of art and culture, and when you're doing that in New York City, you're sort of at the epicenter of, a particular sort of wavelength, a particular sort of energy that is sort of progressive in the sense that evolution to some degree is progressive, or so I thought. This notion that to evolve is to grow, is to shift, is to change. And I think, when I first got started, really sort of contributing to publications with recognizable brand names and stuff, and you get that, initial sort of jolt, like, oh, call mom, I did the thing, and I think any writer knows if you publish something, you get paid for it. It's in a cool place, a recognizable place. that always feels good. You feel like you're contributing to the world. Maybe you have something to say. Your voice is being heard. So that it never really goes away. But I do think that if you fashion yourself a writer and not just a reporter, that can kind of come into conflict. I also think, and by think I mean no, this is, available information, that the publishing industry has some financial issues. It's got some political issues, some social issues, some cultural issues, some infrastructural issues, logistical issues. It's got issues. And to speak to those issues is not a complete negation of everything that the news world, the media world, the arts and culture world, as it connects to newspapers, magazines, television news programs, online channels, whatever. There's a tremendous amount of people doing great work. Every day I read, probably way more articles than anyone should, and a lot of them are very good. Quite a few of them, I think, are problematic and wildly so. There's a lot of platforms that do somewhat good work, but are sponsored by, some sort of evil corporation. Some of our most respected publications are completely financed by sort of dubious agents. And I find that to be wildly problematic. A lot of outlets, publications are being consolidated under one parent company or just a small group of parent companies who are consolidating and monopolizing, sort of rendering the sort of political outlook or the tonal voice of these disparate outlets into some sort of homogenous voice, tone, or partisan outlook. And that has proven to be incredibly problematic in terms of, are we getting the truth? Are we getting honest assessments about what's happening in the world? And I think anybody who can step back and really take a look knows that, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff, a lot of really good reporting, but there's also just an ocean of nonsense. And we seem to now be in this recalibration period where people are kind of recognizing this and sort of going slow. Different papers and TV stations are sort of just moving things around and, changing the landscape. But for me, I understood that a couple things. Number one, there were way too many opportunities being presented to me in terms of speaking to interesting people, and the standard paradigm as a freelance person of something comes across my desk or I come across something organically, and then I have to essentially pitch, which means sort of ask permission to either write something or publish something I'd already written. And the lag on that was unsustainable. News moves so quickly, just like technology moves so quickly. News about technology is moving at a rate beyond, even some of our projections 10 years ago. So unless you're deeply embedded at some of these places, some of these news platforms, and there's a lot of good that can come with being a staff writer at some established publication, there's a lot of problems with that too. Some of those problems I just mentioned, and there's others. But it was too slow. And not only that, I was hearing quite often, the budget's just not really here, or we don't really do that here, and basically everybody's playing it safe, and to be clear, also, I think the general online media landscape has been proven to be wildly effective in sort of influencing public opinion and as a marketplace driver and all these things. But there's a lot of problems with it in that it, due to the sort of contention between so-called legacy or mainstream media and everything else, it kind of reaffirms the general sort of political binary of things, and everything sort of continues to move to the extreme. So I think, some combination of continuing to contribute to our established publications, but also having your own outlet to address and field people and stories in real time in order to keep up with how quickly those things move, how many opportunities are presented to me. Sometimes it's, you get an email from a PR company, agency, or whatever, an individual tells you, hey, I'm around and I'm doing this and boom, boom, boom. And, by the time you formulated that pitch and put it in or whatever, who knows? Maybe your editor left to go take a higher paying job. Maybe they got laid off, which is the thing we've been seeing over the last couple of months, right? Not just in, the federal workforce, but across all these tech platforms. And for like a decade now, we've been seeing ongoing mass layoffs at various publications, a rejiggering of the masthead at these various places, editors being fired, new tones, new missions being brought into play. And if you're somebody like me who doesn't want to be sort of holed up at any one particular publication, and I respect people who have a long tenure at these places, but for me, my freedom to be a freelancer, right, to be free to take my lance and get into various adventures, across, the landscape, that paradigm wasn't really working so much anymore, So you and I sort of converged after sort of wrapping up some of those fiscal spaces in Brooklyn. I think I was sort of working on a personal project and sort of lamenting the status of like just the general literary world. There was a writer strike going on in the summer of 23 that both like directly affected me and then even like sort of existentially affected me. I remember, I'm old enough to remember the writer strike going all the way back to like the fall of like 2007. And, that like ushered in reality TV, really, right? Like I remember we were just getting into the golden age of television and suddenly all that went away. And before you know it, it's, Survivor, more of that, more Big Brother. And then before you know it, suddenly, just a few years later, you have Kim Kardashian and Donald Trump in the Oval Office. The sort of like male and female alpha representatives of the reality TV landscape who have since broken through the fourth wall into a very visceral reality or a sort of unreality. So the summer of 2023, understanding the ramifications of the dissolution of great writing meaning, yes, it might hold up these problematic things to us, but ultimately they drive us towards the better angels of our nature and all these kind of things. So to be in that cycle again, the summer of 2023, and knowing the ramifications of, this time around artificial intelligence, which is just, regurgitating content already out there for the most part. Really speaking from a writer's perspective, but obviously this affects, graphic artists, conceptual artists, all this kind of stuff. It was depressing. I was sort of in a sort of depressed state. I think the art world had kind of run a sort of full cycle in terms of addressing notions of representation, but hadn't really figured out yet what the next step was beyond that. And I think now exists in speaking to the contemporary art world. Now it's back to what I call the elevated decorative, which is the understanding that, hey, all right, everybody for the most part is being seen. There's a lot of work to go. But did we all just get starkly reminded that a painting is just a thing that goes over your couch and a sculpture, a thing that goes in the corner? And this doesn't mean that art can't be transcendent. And, the art world has in many ways supported me. Art has often helped to elevate and transform the way I look at things and all that. And I've been very much sustained by the art world and probably will continue to be. But really, over the last year and a half, I've realized that the art world is a very small microcosm that, when it's not really serving us, can actually serve to distract us from the world and how we all live in the world. And in many ways, the art world is a bubble that allows our own vanity and ego to swirl around sort of endlessly as we jockey for ultimately positioning, greater material possessions, and other things like that. And again, like to some degree, I'm not divorced from some of that, but I think the summer of 23, I had stopped being so concerned. And then, this notion of doing things differently, who I was before COVID, who we all were to some degree, and who I was as that wrapped up, I was somebody else. I was sort of a different person, still me at my core, but I had lost the sort of artificial muscle memory of whatever I had been chasing for the better part of a decade, when all the stores, galleries, museums, when all the publications, when all the stuff went away. And I was, somebody who was pointing at all the stuff. When all the stuff went away, I was left with myself and really was pushed to do a real diagnostic, a real examination of who and what I actually am. So when the stuff starts to come back and the whole apparatus starts to come back, a lot of it comes back as it was. And maybe a lot of that apparatus did not go through a similar transformation. Or if it did, it was trying to forget what sort of transformation it had gone through and is trying to get back to its old ways, so to speak. But I felt like I was being asked to perform as my sort of previous self, or like sort of chase the ghost of my former self, this person, and being forced to feel like I had to play that role to sustain myself in New York City. So I think, somewhere around like mid-August 2023, my frustrations with the general landscape and my frustrations with performing as a previous character. I was being asked to return for a sequel, and it was like, I don't know, I don't want to be in that movie necessarily. So right around there is where we, I think, connected in a way that we understood that though our paths had been different, the industry, our talents, our expertise, our, sort of skill sets, our knowledge sets, possibly wildly different, but extremely complementary. And I got a call from you, and I had kind of ignored this call or a version of this call for like a decade, which is, are you going to Burning Man this year? That's not how you sound. But that's how most people who ask if you're going to Burning Man sound. They sound just like that. Like, oh my God, are you going to Burning Man this year? I had never been. And I always thought, no, that's like what they do. I'm not that. I'm like one of those like smart New York City, like art world people. That's like over there. And I'm over here and something else. Well, that something else that I had dissolved to some degree by the point that I received a phone call from you inviting me to come. And that year, and I said yes. And that year was the very rainy one, not the most recent Burning Man, but the one before that. And then I kind of discovered, probably right around it getting extremely wet and scary, uh, that you were maybe also kind of cooking up something new and had sort of sensed, either through my actual sort of monologuing about some of my frustrations and desires, but also just being very perceptive and intuitive, that I could maybe be an ally or an asset as you moved towards building something that can kind of combine all the tools and technologies at our disposal. Not all of them, right? I don't think a blender is involved or anything, but how could something be built? How can several things be built to actually solve the world's most pressing challenges? And me realizing that journalism is so important, to be able to speak freely and challenge authority and highlight injustice. This stuff should never go away. But our ability to do that, and to do that honestly, objectively, and fairly, has never been more difficult. So tell me about that. Tell me about, were you aware of inviting me to go to Burning Man? And by the way, I was ready then. I was like, well, I don't feel like the art world is still serving me in the same way. I don't feel like I'm necessarily in a position to fully serve it in the way that it needed to be served in 2012, making sure everybody is seen and heard fairly if they're doing great work, especially. By the time you get to 2023, the answer is, well, it's not perfect, but it's a lot better, and certainly had reached the point where it was a much more intersectionalized conversation about who should be doing the talking about who and whoever, right? So I felt like a lot of work, or the core mission, had been done, had been completed. And not only that, was potentially even moving to a place that didn't intrigue me to the same degree. So it was exactly at that point that I felt stepping into some other paradigm with a different set of, codes, missions, behaviors, and just generally something that could kind of dust off my cobwebs and perhaps allow me to step out of my own little bubble and figure out where I was, right? So that happened. And yeah, I figured out soon into that you were like, well, if we did do this, if we did try to build something, if we did do this, what would it be like? And then right on the heels of that experience, we pretty much launched right into it. So take me from there, take us up to the present in terms of like what Radical Systems was, the venture studio, that was the first thing, and then how we ended up with Good Standing.
Yeah, I think at that time it was much more of a spark. It was definitely not fleshed out in my head, especially not how it would all happen. But I did feel like I had a sort of playbook in my head of being part of early stage companies, and often not just companies, but platforms, open source technologies. And seeing those things come into fruition and understanding that it was possible to see something come to fruition that would have more benefit to society and have more impact. And I was thinking through, given that it's possible, what are your first steps and how do you go about building really sort of a concept first of what exactly that is. And I think what I had learned was that it's the people involved that are the most important in terms of early stage concepts or something that hasn't been done before. And especially if you're going to be spending a lot of time figuring out that concept, the sort of energy around who's in the room, what are their intentions, and what are their motivations. I had seen that those were the things that often blocked good creative ideas or innovations from actually happening because people actually weren't aligned. And so when I was thinking about how something like this might come about, I was already kind of like, New York's makes sense, and I spoke to that. But I also knew that it was important to work with people who were thinking about things critically and people who had unique perspectives that didn't sound like what everyone else was kind of just saying, or wasn't just going along with things because that's what everyone else was going along with. Because I knew that this type of thinking was going to be difficult to bring into being. It was going to face a lot of scrutiny. It was going to face a lot of pushback. It was going to be new and weird and uncomfortable. So it takes someone who's like willing to navigate all of those like different elements of something new and stay grounded. And what I think appreciated about really just our conversations was that we were able to arrive at truth between each other in terms of ways that you would kind of illuminate things even about my own background that I hadn't even considered from my own perspective. And so I just had a sense that taking on these big problems with this journalism as part of your background, but then also part of a venture capital studio background, could actually be a missing link in why good ideas don't come to fruition. And I think we arrived at that organically, which now it seems to be obvious to me that that is something that's really missing within the entrepreneurial industry and the tech world especially, is that a lot of ventures don't start out really understanding their problem in a multifaceted way enough. And I'm particularly talking about ventures that are trying to address issues like socio and economic issues or climate change or inequality or things that have more than just building a widget that does this, things that are kind of tackling things that have to do with society and humanity. And a lot of times people within that world who were creating something like a blockchain or like a new technology, a social media platform even, they would lose their way because they didn't really spend time thinking through the potential problem that they were solving and all the other problems that were going to come up. So like with social media now, we've seen this, that if you build a platform that prioritizes engagement at all cost, you end up with a platform that turns people against each other. And you end up with a platform that generates data that can be bought and sold and used for purposes that have huge social consequences that actually goes against what most people believe in. So those things actually could have been imagined in the early days of the internet. In fact, they were. People wrote papers about them. People talked about all the potential issues, but those people were not in the rooms of building the technology platforms. I think that's a problem. I think that if we're really trying to build things that don't create more problems, which I think should be the general MO, I think that's where capitalism needs to get to as well. It's like, yes, the thing needs to be sustainable. Profit is good. However, if it's creating all these other problems and you're not helping to try to address those, you're just being negligent. And so I think when I was going about just thinking through this concept of like, okay, what if you had a venture capital firm that could model how to invest in creating companies that help embody these principles and don't create all of these problems, you probably need to do a lot of research in the beginning. And that's another problem in the venture capital or tech world is there's not a lot of money for something like that. They're like, come to me when I can give you $1 million and you can promise me 100x return. And I'm not saying you can't get there with these social projects. I think you can, but the time between identifying what the problem is and reaching that point is quite a long cycle, and there's not a lot of funding available for people to go on that journey. And I think we're missing out on all of the social and, just innovation in general that could happen by not addressing the fact that there's no funding available for that type of a cycle. So Radical Systems was a prototype of that concept to help incubate this first platform that we've built, Good Standing. And we placed sort of journalism at the center stage of what we did in the beginning, where we said, we're going to go within communities that are experiencing a lot of the issues that we're trying to address related to inequality and lack of access to opportunity, difficulty in breaking out of systemic cycles that plague a lot of underserved neighborhoods. We sort of knew the general bucket of problems that we wanted to address. But in terms of what does it mean to go into those communities and really hear the stories of what's being done on local levels already to address those problems, and put aside maybe like our assumptions about what technology could be built to solve that. Because that was another thing that I had started to diagnose as a problem in the tech world, is there was more time and effort spent building things within a laboratory that were talking about all the people they were going to help, but they had none of those people that they were going to help in the room with them making those decisions. So we also just said, let's reverse that and go directly into these communities, and you do classic style reporting on what's going on. And then these reports, or case studies that we call them, that we're developing can help guide us in the technology innovation process and also keep us grounded in what the reality is and what potentially gets built.
Yeah. And there are currently 3 of these case studies. One of them has an investment thesis that was sort of like a springboard to Good Standing, which is really kind of the name of this platform podcast. But it's also the name of a mobile app that's currently in development that does a lot of things. It does everything that we felt was needed to address a complex of problems that individuals within any construct at any size face. Meaning the human being is in many ways an expression and a microcosm of whatever arena they're in. So how can you address problems that an individual might face as they are expressed in their most immediate community, meaning like on their block, in their town or village, in their city, in their state, in their region, in their country, in their hemisphere, in the world? We haven't really gotten off planet yet. And yes, I do think that we've never been in a place where, now more than ever, based on and in light of some recent sort of jarring events, actually focusing on what we can do as human beings to fix problems in the world. You know, the whims of major political shifts and all this kind of stuff. Democracy is good. Behind democracy, 100%. There's no caveat there. But with it comes massive shifts that can disrupt relationships. one paradigm might be in place, and then a completely new administration comes in with a completely different paradigm, shaking things up. And shaking things up can be good, shaking things up can be bad, shaking things up can be good and bad. But what is more important than ever is not standing back and being shaken up ourselves in a passive sense, but actually understanding that it's probably never been more important to take things into our own hands. Now, I think it's probably important to say, you and I are not without our own trials and tribulations, but for a bunch of reasons, are often having a so-called first world conversation, which of course comes with various privileges and stuff like that. And, we couldn't be more aware and sort of grateful. So I do think a huge part of our case studies, and one thing that really sort of came into focus for us, was this notion of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which kind of like crept into the zeitgeist right around the same time we started embarking on these case studies about a year ago. And now it's more in the mainstream, the fear of jobs being taken away or eliminated, whether due to technological shifts or massive sort of political upheavals or what have you. And a lot of people who were or felt safe in their role, whether at a major bank or at some federal agency or at a nonprofit or an NGO or whatever, who felt like they had a situation that was good, and maybe they felt like they were helping people either overseas or in their specific locality, are now looking around and going, well, I thought what I had, this high-level engineering job at like the major tech platforms. What is it? The acronym for
FANG.
FANG. So yeah,
Or it's something else now, but that's what it was.
yeah. The Google, Facebook, or now Meta, Netflix, Amazon, all that. They're laying all these people off. And it's like, well, I thought I was, a real high level person who could, and you're not safe for the people at all. So a lot of people may, in one way or another, who have not been, may come into contact with the fear and the anxiety and insecurity that comes with not just not having a job, but not being able to procure life's basic necessities. Now, of course, there are people who've been struggling with this historically, generationally, for decades. And, more and more wealth gets concentrated at the top, middle class erodes, everything else sort of grows into, a massive collective body that seems to be growing in its sort of collective grievance about this reality in a way that is starting to show all the earmarks of something potentially sort of pre-revolutionary even. And I don't say that in some sort of like histrionic sense. There's some weird stuff going down. But returning to this notion of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what does it mean to put yourself into a position where you can sustain yourself? And America seems to be getting smaller in terms of places where you could live safely and actually thrive in terms of cost. Like eggs being this huge thing. At some point we'll probably go into a whole thing about eggs, but they've become this MacGuffin in society, in culture, in economics, this marker, this speculative asset, this hard asset in and of itself. What is an egg? What is a dozen eggs? How much? So, Ashley, without me going off on Maslow and resources, who has resources, who does not, and why, And what are the obstacles in place that prevent people from sustaining themselves? Is it just a handful of what are now sort of being deemed oligarchs who are unchecked and looking for, a horde, a massive horde in the millions who will just kind of do their bidding in some sort of like techno feudal sort of future, very much in the present now? Or what is it? Is it just the paradigm itself or some combination of those two things reinforcing each other? So I just wanted to like line this up to say what we have built on the heels of all this research at Radical Systems, this venture capital studio that sort of combines journalism and human storytelling with essentially sort of corporate and infrastructural reporting. It's like a weird sort of hybrid that is both really rewarding, but also really challenging, to be honest, to be fair to anyone who goes on Radical Systems and actually reads these case studies. You'll find that you're extremely rewarded, but also challenged in a way where you may not have seen these two sort of styles brought together. But one thing that became clear to us was the reason people struggle is multifaceted. And in that complexity is a bunch of intersecting lines that connect to all these intersecting agents and bodies. And to go in and address one thing fails to address the larger problem. So what we understood was a tool needed to be built that does exactly this, a tool that is capable in the hands of every individual solving this complex intersection of systemic issues in their world. And so this took a lot of writing, investigation, and reporting, and is now bringing us to this point where we're about to introduce this tool, this application to the world in the form of a mobile and web application. So that's called Good Standing. But Ashley, before we talk about Good Standing, I want to go back to how we sort of began. And I think before we do that, I want you to talk about a little bit of time in Africa. And again, this is not sort of dismissing what it means to be who we are and what we are with our, identity complex and all these kind of things, and jumping around the world and going into low income areas or places that have a sort of defined sort of like cultural or sociocultural sort of body and makeup, the body politic. What is that? How does that differ from us? What are the politics and sort of cultural realities and ramifications of us stepping into all these different settings around the world in different regions with their own sets of issues and cultures, et cetera? Just know that, we take a lot of pride in being as sophisticated as possible, as responsible as possible, as self-aware in a positive sense as possible going into these situations. When we do the work, when we do the writing, when we do the building, everyone's being consulted. And we're doing it with hopefully the highest level of consciousness possible in this moment in time, right? So take us essentially, Ashley, from the beginning of Radical Systems, where you were kind of coming from in terms of some of the work you were doing overseas, and why perhaps we chose Baltimore to be the sort of site for case study number one.
Yeah, for me, I wanted to spend time in Africa because I'd been hearing about a lot of projects, some that sounded like they were just getting going, and some that sounded like they'd been in operation for a while. And this I would call microfinance. And people may have heard of things called like the Grameen Bank, which was introduced by a Bangladeshi economist to help women, mostly like rural women, save by forming these saving circles that were useful when you didn't have access to banking infrastructure, or even if you did have access to banking. Oftentimes what these saving circles do is create a social pressure around taking out of your savings, meaning if you are part of one of these groups, you have to get the peers to approve you to take money out. If it's not your turn, they kind of rotate. And it was sort of developed because people didn't have a lot in terms of money, and so they needed to come up with different techniques. Now, I look at that and I say, isn't kind of the underlying problem like sort of a lack of resources in the first place? And yes, these types of systems of management may work, but it's not kind of getting at the underlying issue. And this is just one example of a microfinance project. And again, there's been mixed reports. There's some positive outcomes, but there's enough negative outcomes to cause serious concern. And, before everything happened with USAID, even USAID and World Bank were starting to report that microfinance is not having the benefit that we thought that it would.
Yeah. And, not to take the mic and run, but there were some reports about like UBI, not to get you off track and go back to Africa, but, some stuff about people being, sustained, getting a lifeline, but, famously chatbot or ChatGPT specifically, understanding that AI might eliminate jobs in the future and already is, right? Not might, but might extensively, funded a research project about whether or not UBI, Universal Basic Income, has a long-lasting, not just immediate, but a potentially long-lasting effect in producing productivity and sustaining individuals and communities. And there's been studies of this in different places in the United States, unconditional $1,000 a month or this or that, and some short-term benefits, but also some, unfortunately, lackluster results. And I'm pretty sure one of our case studies points to that research project that ChatGPT did. There's other studies continually happening, but the consensus generally, whether it was microfinance, UBI, time banking, that they never really got there individually. So I'm just opening that conversation up to say it's not just one channel that's been explored, especially in the 21st century. And there's been things like this going back a while, but really in terms of the modern world, the contemporary world, the 21st century world, as it connects to global markets, globalization, the internet, international currencies, what currencies are being used in otherwise sort of sovereign nations, and stuff like that. These are sort of like the preeminent tools that are being explored to help people navigate extreme poverty, systemic cycles of degradation, hyperinflation. All right, so yes, you're in Africa, you're exploring microfinance. What worked? What didn't work? What could be improved? And this is, again, what? Is this like the fall of 22? When were you in Africa? And give us like just a couple spots where you were geographically.
Yeah, sure. And I started going to Africa professionally when I was a consultant for this organization that is called CCSI, and they did workshops and trainings about international law with like government and banking officials across the world, but a lot of my contracts were African countries. So from like 2017 to the pandemic, really, I was back and forth to different African countries, and that experience had opened my eyes to how banking regulation, how things work over there. And at the same time, I have this other background of the tech world, and particularly like the blockchain world, that was constantly making all of these idealistic claims, which excited me about how technology can improve economic development in places that don't have stable functioning economies and have difficulty in terms of things like hyperinflation. And I was constantly one who was saying, okay, well, how is that actually working? And a lot of my questions were often dismissed. So I started to get a little like suspicious around, is this actually happening? And if it is happening, is the impact actually happening? So when I went to Africa, that was the fall of 22, and it was largely to visit some of these projects that I had relationships with and see what was working on the ground, and also do my own sort of research by making relationships with different community groups, which has been a lot of my research in the past, and it's actually quite easy to do. There's a community leader in every community who's running some sort of social cause organization. It's pretty easy to find them. Like, they have flyers up, or they often have like a physical sort of storefront or community center. And we saw this in our case studies on the website. They sort of exemplify that. So I just figured you could pick a place. I picked Nairobi. I picked Nairobi because I kind of felt a similar energy to New York the first time I went there, in the sense that there was a lot of bubbling up there in terms of emergence. There was an arts and culture scene. That was in 2019, the first time I went there. And a lot of that was heavily impacted by COVID. Not so much with like the virus itself there, because people are kind of younger and healthier, but the economy was heavily impacted by COVID, and a lot of that stuff that was just starting to bubble up there in terms of arts, culture, local business, really took a hit after the pandemic. And, in terms of recovering, I think that's a whole different conversation. Yeah.
It may be, obviously a lot of places in New York City suffered and shuttered, places that had good reputations, stuff like that. But a lot of the places that did survive in New York had all this runway, and had all this infrastructural support that it was able to pop up again. And even the bigs and all that, from museums to huge galleries to whatever, big design firms, certainly had their struggles and were perhaps supported by sort of grants and all this kind of stuff. But if you're just emerging, really just recently emerging, and some huge hyper-object event comes around like that, it has the capability of really raising it to the ground or sort of wiping it out almost altogether. All right, so yeah. So this is like October, September, November?
It was, I think I went over there in August of 2022 and stayed for, that, I want to say semester, but that season. And with the intention of potentially working with some of the projects that I had relationships with, what I found was that there were way too many missing links with a lot of those projects in terms of what their potential was, in terms of what they were describing, and what was happening on the ground. And it was like, reverse engineering so many of just the other problems that were happening around these microfinance projects that weren't necessarily their fault. It's just they were very complicated problems to try to solve. And a lot of these projects didn't really have the resources to go about solving those major problems. They maybe had like a budget of like $100,000 grant, and they were trying to take on the lack of an entire, banking and credit infrastructure. So it's kind of a losing battle in the beginning in terms of what these projects are trying to do. What was interesting to me were people who were forming these community organizations. So these are largely like in informal settlements. So they're places where people live in like sort of like plywood, metal tents that they construct on land that they don't necessarily they don't like own the plot of land, but they just sort of form these communities. And they're often in city centers. They often have people like back in the rural communities at home, and they're like kind of sending money back and forth. But the people who are more like able-bodied move to the cities, move to these informal settlements to try to find work. But there's not work. I mean, there's not like a job in the sense of you have something that you're going to get a certain amount of income this week in terms of stability. There's a lot of informal, like piecemeal labor. So there's some research diaries. They're called like the Kenyan Financial Diaries that I read, but they have financial diaries for different regions. And it's a sociologist who writes it. And in the reports on Kenya, which I think are similar to other regions, I think the average source of income per month for an individual who's living in the informal settlements is like 11. So
11 US dollars.
11 different sources of income. During the course of a month, about 5 or 6 of those are maybe doing some sort of job, which might mean watching someone's kids. It might mean doing laundry somewhere. It might mean getting a daily construction gig. It might be driving like a boda, which is a motorcycle, to deliver things. So you have 5 or 6 of those. The other 5 or 6 are friends and family. And what that looks like is, if we're friends in Kenya and we have like a text message on our phones, there's an ongoing financial back and forth between friends and between family members, which is like, hey, I'm short this, can I borrow this? And it's not necessarily all kept track of in like a one-for-one. It's kind of just part of the social fabric there because there's just not enough to go around on a daily basis. So people form these like kind of informal financial networks based upon social relationships. And that was what I found, I guess, I don't know if I want to say it's fascinating. It was just more like, this is what works. It's just building up a lot of social ties. Another point on that. So a lot of people that I talked to would form relationships of credit with small local businesses. So this is like your local person who sells chickens or eggs or bread, or maybe they sell like a few different things at like a little kind of like a place where you could go buy maybe like what we might think of here as like a deli, right? So those places exist all over within the informal settlements. Some are like really small, and some actually are like a physical structure that's been built out and becomes more of like a stable. So they're varying sizes. But anyway, the people that we talk to would often form relationships with people who own those stores, where they would say, I'm short this month, can I pay you next month? So it was very common to have a line of credit with like your local grocery store, and honestly with really anyone that you're buying anything from. Like even like DVDs are really popular for watching movies. So like your DVD store. So it's really common for you to go to the DVD store and you're actually paying him for last month's DVD. And there's like this like ongoing line of credit with everyone.
What were some of the popular movies while you were there? Quick detour. What DVDs did you watch over there?
Well, I didn't have a DVD player, but I saw a lot of DVDs, and I don't remember any ones in particular. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Um,
All right. So yeah, it raises some technological questions about infrastructure and just in terms of taking all the streaming for granted and all that kind of stuff. But all right. Okay. So there's essentially lines of credit being given. And yes, to clarify, 11 different sources of income, half of that maybe being actual sort of businesses, formal in some capacity, and then the other stuff, family, friends. And all right, now continue on. What's happening if, you go back the next month and you haven't really found yourself sort of paid up, so to speak, with the previous month? What happens when the credit starts to run out? Or whether that's with your cousin or your aunt or your friend or your local DVD purveyor.
mhm.
What happens when the credit runs out?
What you're usually trying to do is maximize relationships. So an example is, let's say you buy a bag of rice every week. You probably have 3 or 4 different vendors who you buy that rice from. And so you can spread out the credit that you're getting from the different vendors so that maybe you can pay back this person this week, but then you can borrow from a new person the next week and you can pay them back the next week. So that was something that I learned that people do is they just maintain quality relationships with different individuals, and each of them have their own grace period that they, negotiate. And as long as you remain in good standing with each of these individuals, based upon the context of your own agreement, you can probably, through all these different lines of credit, make things work, at least make them work a little bit better if you were just on your own. Now, this practice is not pulling people out of poverty. And that's the other thing that I saw. So I saw a lot of, claims about technology to kind of like integrate within that practice and make it better, which I was, interested in and investigating. But ultimately, it was coming to the conclusion that it wasn't just enabling that existing practice. There still needed to be economic development that would happen to actually enable the situation to improve. And what that could look like was kind of multifaceted, but I think there's 2 ways of thinking about it, and I think this is similar to the work that we started to arrive at here. One is like, how can you reduce the cost of everyday basic needs? So if we jump to actually America, for example, I think a major cost for a lot of people is childcare. Like, I think there's something like if you're in New York and you're making sort of like an average income, for a lot of people, childcare is like 43% of their income, which is basically like unsustainable if you're not counting even rent in that example. Yeah. So,
which, if rent, I've seen some of these, like not just in New York, but people are talking almost 50%, sometimes more, sometimes a little less, but the days of, let's speak just in New York for a second, the days of finding that deal where you're not paying some, unless you're like an extremely high earner, where that stops to be as relevant or as stressful or urgent or oppressive even. But it sounds like a lot of people who are in that sort of paycheck to paycheck scenario, which is going to increasingly become more and more people, it seems, based on how things are moving, at least in the somewhat like short to midterm. I've heard of like 50% is going to rent, so like, let's say 50% of your income is going to rent and 40% of your income is going to childcare. You're not left with anything. Well, you are. My math would be wrong if you were left with nothing. But obviously, you're beyond strained. And I think that seems to be the issue here. It's like people are beyond strained. And regardless of where you are, and this is America with billionaires, right? And, supposedly the richest country in the world. I think even if you're the most liberal or progressive person in the world, you have to be realistic about how America itself and its own finances are being strained, supporting the strained, right? So like there's a convergence here happening between sort of like the state and the individual, and then the extremely wealthy, small, like 0.1% of individuals who are amassing so much wealth, right? So these things have never been in kind of like closer contention just here, right? So if that's the case here, if you're talking about places around the world that have historically, systemically been dealing with, true extreme poverty, right? Where usually those same things are compounded, exacerbated, right? Like that's craziness. So you were going back to this notion of like, how do you reduce cost if, let's say, childcare is at 40%, or even in New York, like as we like move towards like another mayoral race or something, some of the candidates bubbling up, it's like affordability of housing, right? The availability, the affordability of housing, as much as any other sort of issue. But that really, in terms of like looking after the people in various boroughs who are not able to pay these exorbitant rents or are chasing after these sort of like precious locales or whatever, that seems to be the thing among food, right? The egg, again, being the sort of marker of affordability. It's this, and it could be this. Well, now it's this, and what's this, and what are the factors, And, eggs were as relevant during like, the early spikes of inflation, where it was like, oh, they're this, and it's about supply line, it's supply channels, and it's about this post-COVID. And it's like, well, now why is it this? So is there reporting being done that can keep up what all these things are? Is this happening? Yes. But there's one thing to report, right? And this is like sort of bringing us back to our paradigm. There's one thing to report, and then there's one thing to build or to address. And not only that, to truly address what parties, how many entities, individuals, agencies, corporations have to come together in like urgent confluence to actually do this. All right. So this is why I think Africa was interesting, right? Not as just like you sort of interloping and but really kind of putting yourself down there to see what's happening and where is the true impact. All right, so yes, take us there and then sort of bring us sort of out of Africa. But tell us about some of the success stories. Tell us about some of the sort of failures, maybe not so much on the ground, but perhaps. But, one thing we talk about a lot is, in the venture capital world, there might be some technology discussed, and a couple people get in the room and somebody makes a great pitch and they get some investment capital. A lot of times companies build up all this investment just because one person invested. That one person maybe has a bit of a reputation, goes, oh, well, this person gave me this, and that has allowed me now to go get this money, this money, and this money. And it's all with this sort of intention, and maybe there's a nice pitch deck put together. I don't know who said it, but like decks write checks or something like that. So maybe you put together like a nice presentation and you get this funding, but it doesn't really work, or it doesn't really stick, or it kind of like floats the boat for a little bit and then the faucet runs out and the people on the ground are kind of, left like this with their hands in the air, looking around sort of incredulously or with a sense of sort of disappointment. But that small group of people in that sort of project microcosm, the people at the sort of like the venture capital side of things, or maybe the executives or founders in that project, are able to walk away and exit with a considerable amount of money, right? And then what starts to sort of be revealed is like that might even be the intention. Like there is actually little intention for the thing to work. It's all about, is this a good enough idea? Does the IP have enough credibility to generate investment capital? And can a small group of people put that capital in their pockets and then kind of wash their hands and walk away and say, well, we tried, and then they're on to the next thing. Maybe they're on to the next thing before that thing even fizzles out, and then it's like sort of like rinse, repeat. So I know this has been your frustration with things, and even as we've been maneuvering, running into people who are surprised that we have absolutely zero interest in doing things that way. That no, we're looking to build real tools, real projects, and we're looking to create real impact. And it's been interesting. It's been interesting to hold true to that. All right, so again, take us back to on the ground, whether it's Nairobi or Kenya, and from your perspective, seeing this sort of paradigm play out or not, and then bringing us back here to the States.
Yeah, I think the major thing I learned was the forming of social relationships as being the necessary foundation for solving big systemic problems. So in the example and the informal settlements in Nairobi, you have people that were figuring out how to make sort of their own kind of banking and financial infrastructure on top of the kind of formal economy that existed in terms of money, but they built like their own way of making that work. Now, I think there's a lot to learn from that in the sense of it's maybe not always money that solves problems. It's like how we organize ourselves given the resources that we have. And I still think there's a long way to go there. I still think there's a lot more resources built. But I think what could potentially work better now that I understand that more is how do you integrate within that existing social fabric and not just provide these individual microfinance loans to individuals, but figure out how to provide community financing projects that develop infrastructure. It's more from an economic development approach. It creates jobs. I think that type of approach could really lift people out of poverty. And just another point on that, another thing that I came across in my research, for example, is even when there are infrastructure projects that are funded by these now aging out institutions like USAID or World Bank, a lot of that money would end up going to Western companies. So it's like, oh, we're going to build roads in Africa. Like intuitively, that should make jobs for Africans in those countries, which would help stimulate economic development. But often that wasn't happening. So that's just like one example of these programs, even though there is money, they're not being administered correctly. And this is not throwing everyone under the bus, but it's saying there's a lot of examples where they're not being thought about in terms of their long-term impact. And therefore, a lot of the money that we've been spending, whether that's in this country or whether that's abroad on things like aid or economic development, aren't actually having those results because they weren't thought through enough to think about how to have those long-term results. So I think at the end of Africa, I sort of left thinking I was going to come back the next fall to do more work there. And after I took a step back when I was back here in the US, and I just saw that it was going to be a much longer road. I saw that the problems in terms of being able to work somewhere like Africa and actually have an impact would require a lot more resources than I was going to be able to drum up, even the types of financing impact projects that were out there for like tech for good stuff, the amount of money that they were offering for things like this just really wasn't feasible to take on the systemic issue. So that was kind of clear to me. And then also the nature of doing work over there, you're dealing with so many unknowns, like every day. Just, I mean, America's becoming more like this now, but over there, it's like that's definitely the paradigm. You just don't really know tomorrow when you wake up, is this government agency going to exist? Is it going to, pull my regulation for being a technology company that's not local or whatever it is? So I think in terms of getting something started, it's just more difficult to do work over there until you've kind of maybe proven something out elsewhere. So that was one kind of thing. And then I think second, when I came back and then when we started talking about the case study model, it also was becoming clear to us that there were a lot of communities within the U.S. that just needed better access to resources here. And so starting here just made more sense from that perspective in terms of we could, really get things going here, get more support here, and with a kind of proven model, start to build relationships with some of these organizations that I had been meeting abroad.
Yeah. And I think because of our respective histories, we understood that America might find itself in this position, in this state, America and Americans and the international community of human beings who are both positively and negatively affected by what's happening in the United States, as far as our own dollar, our own economy, our own politics, our general vibe as it's put out around the globe. So I think, on one hand, we are in a position to do great things at a time where it's needed most. And the research we put in over the last couple of years, and, me just as a writer, so grateful to be sort of supported to do that sort of in-depth work, to do essentially across 3 case studies, which are all quite beefy. They're all quite hefty. Hopefully they're interesting reads too, right? Because what was important, what we both sort of came to was, a lot of case studies that are done, the reports from Chatbot GBT about UBI or whatever, if you're a technical person and you're interested in these subjects, they could be very interesting. Reading a report about anything, But I think what we understood is at the center of these issues, there are human beings. And not only human beings who are, caught in these systemic cycles, but human beings who maybe previously were, or they've been in proximity to those issues, or maybe they just really want to affect serious change and create serious impact, put themselves into these change maker positions, not influencers, which feels like already a kind of old notion to be an influencer. It feels very much in the past now. And, no disrespect to pushing art and fashion and other things. We all use products and wear clothes and do stuff. And neither of us are completely averse to nice things. But I think the influencer of the immediate present and hopefully the future is somebody who is positively and directly affecting the lives of human beings and individuals. And just one more sort of asterisk there, musicians, artists, filmmakers, dancers, poets, these people have been instrumental to my life and will continue to be. So there's no knock to people who have it as their mission to change lives and to change the world, change the vibe, change the paradigm, to reinforce positive paradigms and constructs through their art, But I think there's a lot of passive behavior when it comes to how human beings engage with the world, Like we are possibly moving into an age that requires a little bit more hands-on heavy lifting from everyday citizens, not just to sustain oneself individually, but to sustain your communities, to sustain your city, the infrastructure, et cetera, especially if you're not lucky to be immersed or insulated in very much sort of safe first world bubbles. What is being done? What is being built? So, yeah. And Ashley, we're coming almost to a 2-hour mark. And I think wrapping this up with pointing people to the case studies without necessarily going in depth, maybe the next time, if people do listen, they can go just kind of check these things out. And again, they're beefy. If you're a ravenous consumer of the written word, and you like where human and infrastructure meet, please read these things at our venture capital website.
It's radicalsystems.com, and radical has 2 eyes.
Why does radical have 2 eyes? I remember when I first saw that, I said, oh, this is going to be a problem for email. But I've so come to sort of appreciate our unique spelling.
Well, the first answer is because there's a Radical Systems already that has 1 eye. And I like the idea of radical in terms of the Latin word for radix and getting to its roots. And it didn't seem right to abandon the idea of radical systems, because I think that's the best description of what this really is getting to the root cause a lot of our problems, and designing systems that address those root causes, and also making sure that we're not setting up systems that create other types of problems because it's avoiding sort of the root issues. And the radii of the circle being sort of like the simplest way to think about how to solve a problem and still find some sort of elegant way to arrive at what that solution could be.
Yeah. So, Baltimore, part of it was, this city that has a lot of interesting things going on, sports teams, food, music, really recently contemporary art, a lot of interesting cultural things to be proud of, but also problems articulated in that great HBO TV series, The Wire, and then just sort of famously struggling with a lot of urban, not as a code word, but in a city, dealing with a lot of your sort of historical struggles with systemic violence, poverty, crime, etc., and a lot being done, right? But we had a contact there who had created a farm to school program, meaning why can't children not just eat at all, right? Because it's an issue that many kids, students at the preschool level, elementary level, all the way through, K through 12 in the United States aren't eating lunch at all. You know what I mean? I think this is when we talk about billionaires and we talk about kids not being able to afford school lunch and not being able to bridge that at all is just so criminal, right? This was something that I think we understood would connect with all human beings, right? Can't we arrive at a point where if we're going to basically compel children to go to school 5 days a week for most of the calendar year, that they should at least be able to eat lunch, maybe breakfast and lunch? Why is this not happening? Why can't we do this? What is the problem here? All right, so that's number one, are kids eating at all? And then number two, are they eating healthy food or are they eating toxic waste, or worse, So this was just something that we thought was a nice place to start, was connecting this notion of a child to healthy food. And what is healthy food? It's usually natural food. It's food that comes from the earth, right? It's not processed. It's not drowning in chemicals. And yes, we're going to probably at some future date break down the complexity of what it means to take a deep dive into America's health problems and the problems of the world. So I guess for now, Ashley, without really going too in depth with all these case studies and how the case studies led us to Good Standing, this web and mobile platform, and not only this podcast that will not really serve completely as a vanity project, maybe slightly, mostly for me, but really as just a platform for us to talk about how human beings can face all these challenges that seem to be getting worse, and in occasions where they're getting better, equally, there is room for discussion. And a lot of times things are getting both better and worse at the same time. The classic 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, 1 step back. It's usually things like this. And the general sort of media landscape either wants to frame things as a winning or losing gesture, depending on what team would most benefit from that sort of messaging, right? So we are here to create a platform in the heart of New York City. That's right. To field people who are doing work at the most local level, people who are doing work at the federal and international level, across the full spectrum of human engagement, and hopefully pull them into a platform we're developing that will amplify their activities in a way that doesn't serve apathetic techno oligarchs, but actually serves us. And by us, I mean humanity. I mean individuals. So yeah, I would say go check out Radical Systems. Radical has 2 eyes. And read these case studies or give them a little perusal. Check them out. There's 3. And it was really that first one that put us on a course to write an investment thesis that we termed Good Standing. And, you know, maybe we'll launch into the next one, not just to talk a little bit more about the sort of respective case studies, but just this term that we've landed on, Good Standing. What does that mean? And what are all the sort of permutations, definitions, approaches to this term, good standing? What does that mean? What does that mean for us individually? What does that mean for you? And what does that mean in an almost sterile, clinical, economic sense? What does that potentially mean in a spiritual, emotional, or psychological sense, or just in a sort of practical sense? This term sort of cuts across every dimension of life, and it's universal. Universal in that we believe all human beings, in one way or another, truly, deeply in their heart, want to be in good standing. And as, you know, a writer, I think about these sort of classic categories in terms of what a text may or may not be: man versus man, man versus God, man versus nature, you know, insert whatever sort of genders versus man, nature, and God you would like, woman, they, them, etc., versus man, nature, and God. But what does it mean to be in good standing with man? What does it mean to be in good standing with nature or God, and whatever definition that means for you? To be in good standing with your soul, to be in good standing with your community, your family, your friends, you know, your boss, your landlord, your tenant, your constituency, whatever, your students, you know, the list goes on. It's time for us to start thinking more deeply about what this means in a way that doesn't alienate anyone. And we are not the arbiters of good standing. I know I'm not perfect, but I do think that it's time that we create a platform that allows people from all walks of life, from all generations, from all backgrounds, ethnicities, races, lifestyles, come together to have a discussion about whether or not we're all collectively doing the right thing for each other and for the world. So, yeah, so go check out Radical Systems, and you'll probably start seeing more from us about good standing and what that means, not only on this show, which is going to evolve as we go, as we kind of like get our sea legs a little bit and have all sorts of really cool guests on. But also, we hope to invite people onto this platform at a time where we're rightfully so dealing with a reckoning in regards to social media and technology in general. All right, Ashley. So I just said a mouthful there. What are your thoughts, and maybe take us out?
Yeah, I think that we covered a lot of ground today. I think there's a lot to get into in terms of what we're thinking about in terms of the future. I think we spent a lot of time covering the past, and I think that was important because there actually was a lot of research that we embarked on, and I think we can say that we're not closing out the research, but we're just moving on to a different phase of saying, here's what we've learned from, our respective careers, but also from the past with just Radical Systems and these case studies. And I think going forward, what we see is that there's a lot of potential to highlight the good work that's already happening that doesn't get covered on today's social media platforms or existing, mainstream media. And that's because that stuff isn't polarizing. So we feel that it's really important to create a space to highlight the stuff that actually most people agree upon. Like, most people think it's really great that there's organizations that are providing after-school programs for kids, which in fact exist literally within every neighborhood. And we want to highlight the stories of people who are from those backgrounds, who have created these organizations, and also highlight the solution-oriented approach. And we have come across how many people there are doing stuff like this, and I think we have the understanding that the more that we sort of help highlight that and foster that movement, the more that people will start to see that there's actually a lot more potential in terms of this moment in American history and global history to come out of this a lot better than we were before. And the kind of hope and focus and inspiration driving this is to help just first believe in that and kind of give real life examples of that, but then also start to actually implement that on larger and larger scales. So thanks for tuning in.